It's not that I don't love Michael. Of course I do. But lately, it's like I'm living with a ghost. He spends hours hunched over his computer, eyes glued to lines of code that don't seem like they'll ever end. He'll go from morning to late at night without so much as looking up, and sometimes I feel like I'm the only one still existing in our relationship. It's not that I'm trying to be demanding or overly needy, but it's hard to not feel invisible. I remember when we first moved into this apartment. It had that fresh, still smells like paint kind of vibe, full of possibilities. So we picked out everything together, from the soft, earth-toned couch to the mismatched coffee mugs we thought were quirky. I imagined filling the space with laughter, shared dinners, and lazy Sunday mornings tangled in each other's lives. Now it's just silence, punctuated by the hum of his computer fan or the occasional clack of his keyboard. Most days it's like living with the shell of someone I used to know, and it's exhausting. That's why Chris and Matt's loft has become a sort of sanctuary for me. It's only a few blocks away, but being there feels different, like the world starts moving again. Matt always has some fun story or a stupid joke that leaves us in fits of laughter. And Chris, well, he's more grounded, always looking out for everyone, making sure Matt's antics don't get out of control. We've got this rhythm when we hang out, whether it's watching movies or playing board games. There's a liveliness. It's a sharp contrast from the cold, dim quiet of my apartment. The loft itself is a place I always get drawn into. There's this artsy vibe to it. Matt, having decorated veranda with random photography prints from his travels, while Chris keeps it functional, always having fresh snacks and drinks ready. I'm not ashamed to admit I've lost entire afternoons just lounging on their big, worn leather couch, wrapped up in this cocoon of comfort that's so far removed from the detached space with Michael. I know they notice how often I show up. I can see it in their faces when I drift in after dinner, but clearly haven't eaten. Chris will hand me a beer without saying anything, always understanding more than he lets on, like he's silently watching over me. It was a Wednesday, I think, or maybe Thursday, doesn't matter. One of those days where everything felt heavier than it should. Michael had canceled on me again. Something about a critical bug that his team needed to fix. Funny how it always came back to that damn computer and its problems, as we hardly ever got fixed these days. I stared at my phone for a good 10 minutes after reading his text. It sat there, glowing like this ghost light on the screen, illuminating the small corner of the couch I'd buried myself in, waiting for a reply that wasn't coming. I wanted some kind of fight, a sign that we were still worth fighting for, still something. Instead, I got silence. He wasn't even home. His office had become his second apartment by now. Then there's me alone in our too quiet apartment. Our space felt too big and empty those nights, like the walls were caving in, narrowing down until I couldn't breathe anymore. So naturally, I picked up my phone, typed out a quick text to Matt. His place was always a mess of sketches, Polaroids, beer bottles, and life. Life I could never seem to find here, in the void of white walls and buzzing electronic. I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The loft Matt and Chris shared was different from any place I'd ever been, where everything in my apartment with Michael was sterile and controlled. Theirs was chaos in the best sense. Stuff everywhere, Matt's cameras littered across the shelves, unfolded clothes on the floor, quirky posters layered over brick walls. And you couldn't help but feel alive in that space, alive in ways Michael never allowed me to feel anymore. So by the time I got there, both of them were lounging on the couch, arguing over who had better taste in movies or bands or whatever it was that night. Matt was sprawled out, half an arm tucked under his head, free-spirited as ever. Chris, always the quieter one, gave me that look he does, steady, but saying way more than he'd ever need to say out loud. And they both knew. They always knew. Matt shot up as soon as I walked in. Isolde, about time you brought the sunshine around here. And for a while, it worked. Being there worked. They immediately knew how to tune out whatever mess was tangling me up inside. So between the banter and the beers, I'd forget for a bit just how empty things had become with Michael. We talked about everything. Music, art, whatever random documentary Matt had shot in some desolate expanse that week. Easy stuff Michael never talked about anymore. Was as if that part of him had shut itself down for code and programming deadlines. The visits, they started like that casual and comforting. And Matt, charismatic as he was, always knew how to make me laugh out loud, sometimes without even trying. Chris kept things more grounded, but the way he'd bring me a drink or sit next at me when Matt's antics got a little too wild was its own kind of comfort. They balanced each other out perfectly, and hell, for a while, I found myself craving that balance more than anything else in my life. I wanted that warmth, that human connection. It felt easy, it felt right. And the days turned into nights, the nights into longer, later stretches. I'd tell myself I'd just hang for an hour or two, but then the hours would slip away like they always seemed to do in that loft. Nat would be pouring another drink while Chris joked about something that happened at the bar. It was effortless, too effortless. Maybe I'd go home way past midnight to a cold bed next to a man I barely shared more than 2 sentences with at that point. And the argument with Michael that broke things was the worst, though, and it cut deep. Beep. It was late, long past the time when we used to catch dinner together, and my phone crumpled with some cryptic, short text about him staying late again. I snapped, threw my phone down hard enough to crack the case, because there wasn't even a real fight left in us. I felt invisible, like he wasn't even seeing me there anymore, just some ghost lingering in the backdrop of his life. I went to the loft that night starting in, and immediately Matt and Chris could see it in my face. Chris was off to make me a drink without even asking. Matt, he didn't say anything at first, but he gave me that cocky smirk he always had, like he knew how to diffuse everything if I'd let him. I'm done, I muttered, collapsing into their worn-out couch. So done. Matt raised an eyebrow with Michael. That was the question, wasn't it? It sat between us, daring me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. So the loft, the brothers, they'd become more than an escape. They were filling something I was scared to fully admit I need. Chris sat down next to me, closer than usual, handing over the glass before his eyes held mine. That lounged back, but something about his eyes watching the scene unfold between Chris and me carried a certain tension. So one that cut right through the bullshit we'd all pretended wasn't there. "You're not done," Matt finally muttered, leaning forward, lips quirking into a half grin as he spoke. "You don't even know what you want yet?" I knew what that grin meant, though, and the spark in his eyes was all the invitation I needed to let myself sink into them. I should have said something, done something, but I didn't. Or maybe I didn't want to. I was tired of wanting everything and having none of it. And then there was, Matt's voice dropped lower, coaxing hints of something playful yet dangerous. I found myself caught in a whirlwind of emotions and desires, then desires, the passionate night with Matt, and Chris had awakened something in me I didn't know existed. It was thrilling, forbidden, and addictive. So in the days that followed, I couldn't get them out of my head. Every moment at home with Michael felt hollow, a stark reminder of what was missing in our relationship. He barely noticed my absence that night, engrossed in his latest project. When I returned, he merely grunted a hello without looking up from his screen. I started finding excuses to visit the loft more frequently. Just going to hang out with the guys, I'd say casually. Michael would nod, his eyes never leaving his computer. Each time I stepped into that familiar space, my heart raced with anticipation. One afternoon, I arrived to find Chris alone, wiping down the bar. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Hey, Izzy," he said softly, coming around the bar. "Matt's out on a shoot." I felt a mix of disappointment and an excitement. "Oh, that's okay. I can come back later." Chris moved closer, his hand brushing my arm. "Or you could stay. We don't need Matt to have a good time." My skin tingled where he touched me. I knew I should leave, but I didn't want to. Chris pulled me close, his lips finding mine in a hungry kiss. We stumbled towards his room, shedding clothes along the way. Afterwards, lying in his bed, guilt gnawed at me. But when Chris pulled me, murmuring how beautiful I was, I pushed the feeling aside. The next time, it was Matt who greeted me at the door. His easy smile and playful demeanor drew me in like a moth to a flame. So we ended up on the roof, a bottle of wine between us, laughing and talking as the sun set. "You're different when you're here," Matt said, his fingers tracing patterns on my palm. "More alive?" I sighed, leaning into him. "I feel more alive here." We made love under the stars, the city lights think around us. Days blurred into weeks. I found myself living 2 lives, the dutiful girlfriend at home and the passionate lover at the loft. Michael remained oblivious, buried in his work. He'd mutter about a big project, how it would change everything for us. I nodded and smiled, all the while thinking of my next escape. But as exhilarating as it was, the weight of my deception grew heavier. One night, after a particularly intense session with both Matt and Chris, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. "You okay?" Matt asked, propping himself up on an elbow. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." Chris reached over, squeezing my hand. "About Michael?" I nodded, unable to meet their eyes. I don't know how long I can keep this up." "You don't have to decide anything right now," Matt said, kissing my shoulder. "We're here for you, whatever you choose." Their understanding only made me feel worse. I slipped out early the next morning, determined to reconnect with Michael. But when I got home, he was exactly where I'd left him, hunched over his keyboard, mumbling about algorithms. I tried to engage him, suggesting we go out for breakfast. He waved me off, promising we'd celebrate once his project was done. Defeated, I retreated to the bedroom, my phone already in hand to text Matt and Chris. The cycle continued. I'd wake up next to Michael, feeling guilty and determined to make things work. But by evening, I'd find myself back at the loft, losing myself in the warmth and attention of my stepbrothers. One afternoon, I arrived at the loft to find Matt and Chris in a heated discussion. They fell silent when I entered, exchanging meaningful glances. "What's going on?" I asked, suddenly nervous. Matt ran a hand through his hair. "We were just talking about this. As we're worried about you, Izzy," Chris added, his brow furrowed with concern. I felt my defenses rise. "I'm fine. Everything's fine." Matt stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "Is it? You're constantly on edge, always looking over your shoulder. This isn't fair to you." "Or to Michael," Chris said quietly. And so the truth of their words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sank onto the couch, tears welling up. "I don't know what to do," I whispered. "I can't imagine my life without you two, but I can't keep lying to Michael either." So they sat on either side of me, their presence both comforting and overwhelming. Matt wrapped an arm around my shoulders while Chris held my hand. "We love you, Izzy," Matt said softly, "but we can't keep watching you tear yourself apart like this." Chris nodded. "You need to make a decision, for your own sake." I knew they were right, but the thought of choosing terrified me. How could I give up the safety and stability of my life with Michael? But how could I walk away from the passion and connection I'd found with Matt and Chris? So as I left the loft that day, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I knew something had to change, but I had no idea how to move forward without destroying everything in the process. I felt a pit in my stomach as I lounged on the couch at Matt and Chris's loft. The guilt was gnawing at me, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The warmth and energy here was intoxicating compared to the cold silence of my apartment with Michael. My phone buzzed. Another message from Michael, probably asking when I'd be home. I ignored it, focusing instead on Chris mixing drinks at the makeshift bar. "Another round?" he called over, flashing that irresistible grin. I nodded, pushing away thoughts of Michael. Here I could just be myself. No expectations, no disappointment. Matt sauntered in from his darkroom, camera in hand. "Got some great shots today," he announced, flopping down beside me, his arm draped casually over my shoulder, sending tingles down my spine. We fell into easy conversation, laughing and teasing. Hours slipped by unnoticed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the loft, Chris joined us on the couch. "You staying the night?" he asked, his voice low and inviting. I hesitated. I should go home. Michael would be wondering where I was, but the thought of returning to that sterile apartment, to Michael's distracted presence. Yeah, I breathed. "I'm staying." What happened next was a blur of hands, lips, and tangled limbs. We stumbled up stairs, clothes discarded along the way. In the bedroom, I lost myself in Matt and Chris, pushed all thoughts of Michael from my mind. Afterward, as we lay entangled in the sheets, reality began to seep back in. The guilt returned full force, threatening to choke me. "I should go," I mumbled, extracting myself from their embrace. Matt caught my wrist. "Isolde, wait." I turned, seeing the concern in both their eyes. Chris sat up, running a hand through his tousled hair. "We can't keep doing this. So it's tearing you apart. Apart. Ta. Wort." I know, I whispered, tears pricking at my eyes. Matt's voice was gentle. You need to make a decision. This isn't fair to anyone, not us, not Michael, and definitely not you. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. They were right, of course. But how could I choose? How could I give up either the stability and history I had with Michael or the passion and connection I felt with Matt and Chris? I dressed quickly, mumbling vague promises to figure things out. As I left the loft, the weight of my choices pressed down on me. I had no idea how to move forward without losing everything. The walk home was a blur. My mind raced, replaying moments with Michael, with Matt and Chris, trying to make sense of the mess I'd created. By the time I reached our apartment, I was exhausted. I opened the door, bracing myself for Michael's indifference, but the apartment was dark and silent. "Michael?" I called out hesitantly. No response. Relief and disappointment warred within me. Part of me had hoped he'd be here, that we could talk, that I could confess everything and somehow make it right. I moved through the apartment, noting Michael's laptop was missing from its usual spot. He must be working late again. The thought should have frustrated me, but instead I felt only hollow. I showered, scrubbing my skin raw as if I could wash away my guilt along with any lingering traces of Matt and Chris. Afterward, I curled up in bed, clutching Michael's pillow. His scent lingered, familiar and comforting despite everything. Sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, plagued by indecision. The hours crawled by, my mind a chaotic whirl of what-ifs and should-haves. As dawn broke, I heard the apartment door open. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Then Michael appeared in the bedroom doorway. One look at his face and I knew. He knew. So the silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken accusations. Michael's eyes, usually warm and inviting, were cold and distant. I opened my mouth, desperate to explain, to apologize, to say anything that might fix this. But before I could speak, Michael turned and walked away. I heard the bathroom door close, then the sound of the shower running. I lay there frozen as the magnitude of what I'd done crashed over me. The double life I'd been living had finally caught up with me, and I had no idea how to salvage any of it. When Michael emerged from the bathroom, dressed for work, he barely glanced in my direction. "I have an early meeting," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "We'll talk later." The door closed behind him with a quiet click, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my choices. I woke up to an empty bed, the sheets cold beside me. Michael had already left for work, and the silence in our apartment felt oppressive. The events of the past few weeks crashed over me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for air. I stumbled to the kitchen, desperate for coffee to clear my head. As I waited for the machine to brew, I noticed Michael's mug in the sink, unwashed. It was unlike him to leave dishes behind. My stomach churned with anxiety. The entire morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Michael's behavior had been off lately, but this felt different, more final. I tried to distract myself with work, but my mind kept wandering back to the coldness in his eyes when he left this morning. So by evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I paced the living room, waiting for Michael to come home. When I finally heard his key in the lock, my heart leaped into my throat. He walked in, his face a mask of indifference. Without a word, he headed straight for the bedroom. I followed, my legs shaking. "Michael, we need to talk." He turned to face me, his eyes hard. "About what? Assault? About how you've been lying to me for weeks." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "I saw the messages on your phone. I know about Matt and Chris." And the world tilted on its axis. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. "Michael, I don't." His voice cracked. "Just don't." Tears welled up in my eyes. "I'm so sorry. I need to vent." "To what?" "To cheat on me with your stepbrothers. To make a fool out of me." His words were like daggers, each one piercing deeper than the last. I couldn't hold back the sobs anymore. It just happened. I felt so alone, and they were there, and I wasn't. Michael's laugh was hollow because I was too busy working, right? "That's your excuse." "Not letting me say, "Yedi ba tracent." "No, I mean, yes, but it's more complicated than that." "Complicated?" Michael's voice rose. "What's complicated about betraying someone who loved you?" The past tense hit me like a slap. "Loved?" Michael's shoulders sagged. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Isolde." I reached out to him, but he flinched away. Please, Michael, we can work through this. I'll end things with Matt and Chris swear. I swear. It's too late for that. He moved past me, grabbing a duffel bag from the closet. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. I'll come back for the rest of my things later. Panic clawed at my chest. You're leaving? Just like that? Michael paused at the bedroom door. What did you expect, Isolde? That idols, you chose them over me multiple times. I wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, but the words died in my throat. He was right. I had made my choice, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. As the front door closed behind Michael, I sank to the floor, my body racked with sobs. The full weight of what I'd done crashed down on me. I'd ruined everything, my relationship with Michael, my friendship with Matt and Chris, even my own self-respect. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in my grief and guilt. When I finally picked myself up, I felt hollow, empty. The apartment that had once been our home now felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. I stumbled to the bathroom, barely recognizing the woman in the mirror. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair a tangled mess. Was this really me? The person who had hurt so many people I cared about? As I splashed water on my face, my phone buzzed. A message from Matt. Hey, you okay? We haven't heard from you in a while. So I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the reply button. What could I possibly say to them? That Michael knew everything? That our lives were in shambles because of what we'd done? In the end, I turned off my phone without replying. I couldn't face them. Not yet. Not when I could barely face myself.